Have you ever wondered about the nature of God in Christianity and how it has been perceived throughout history? Let us travel back to the 2nd century, a time of fervent theological exploration within Christianity. Amidst this backdrop emerged Marcionism, a Christian movement founded by Marcion of Sinope. This was no ordinary movement. Marcion's distinctive teachings rattled the foundations of traditional Christian beliefs, igniting a blaze of controversy that would continue to smolder well after his time. What made Marcion's teachings so distinctive, you ask? Marcion challenged the established notions about God, the scriptures, and salvation. He proposed a radical reinterpretation of Christian theology, one that departed from the mainstream and ventured into uncharted territories. Marcion was not just a religious reformer, but also a radical thinker. He dared to question the conventional understanding of God, presenting a drastically different perspective. Marcion's God was not the singular deity of mainstream Christianity, but rather two distinctive entities. His teachings portrayed a vivid dichotomy between the God of the Old Testament, often associated with law, judgment and wrath, and the God of the New Testament, a deity of mercy and love. This dichotomy was not merely a theological curiosity, but a profound challenge to the traditional Christian worldview. For Marcion, the Old Testament God was a lesser deity, one whose actions were characterized by harshness and severity. In stark contrast, the God of the New Testament, revealed through Jesus Christ, was a benevolent figure, embodying grace, mercy, and love. In essence, Marcionism proposed a radical shift in how Christians should perceive God and interpret their scriptures. It challenged the conventional wisdom and stirred a passionate debate that tested the boundaries of Christian theology. Let us delve deeper into the radical theological concepts that set Marcion's teachings apart. As we unravel the threads of Marcionism, we'll explore how this 2nd century movement continues to reverberate through the corridors of Christian thought, sparking discussions about the nature of God, the interpretation of scriptures, and the path to salvation. Central to Marcion's teachings is a rather bold assertion. This 2nd century Christian reformer proposed a radical idea that challenged the traditional Christian beliefs. He suggested that the God of the Old Testament, known as the Demiurge, and the God of the New Testament, the true God, were entirely separate entities. Marcion's conception of the Demiurge was controversial, to say the least. He portrayed this Old Testament deity as a malevolent figure, one associated with law, judgment, and wrath. This was a deity who demanded strict adherence to laws and was swift to punish those who strayed from the path. The Demiurge was a god of retribution, a stark contrast to the merciful God revealed by Jesus Christ. To Marcion, the God of the New Testament was a figure of pure benevolence. This was the true God, a deity of love, mercy, and forgiveness. In his teachings, Marcion emphasized the stark difference between the two. The God of the Old Testament was a God of fear and punishment, whereas the God of the New Testament was a God of love and salvation. This belief in two separate deities was a radical departure from traditional Christian theology. Most Christians believe in one God who is both just and merciful, a deity who punishes sin but also offers redemption. Marcion, however, saw these two aspects as incompatible. To him, the wrathful God of the Old Testament could not be the same as the loving God of the New Testament. Marcion's beliefs sparked intense debate within the early Christian community. His teachings challenged the very foundation of Christian theology, the belief in one God. It forced Christians to confront difficult questions about the nature of God and the interpretation of Scripture. Yet despite the controversy, Marcion's teachings resonated with many. His emphasis on a loving and merciful God appealed to those who struggled with the harsher aspects of the Old Testament. And his interpretation of the Scriptures offered a new perspective on the Christian faith, one that prioritized love and mercy over law and judgment. However, Marcion's teachings also attracted criticism. His belief in two separate gods was seen by many as a dangerous heresy, a deviation from the true faith. And his portrayal of the Old Testament God as a malevolent figure was considered a gross misinterpretation of the Scriptures. Despite the controversy, Marcion's teachings have had a lasting impact on Christian theology. His belief in two separate gods may not have been widely accepted, but his emphasis on God's love and mercy has resonated with Christians throughout the ages. And his radical interpretation of the scriptures has continued to spark debate, forcing Christians to confront difficult questions about the nature of God and the meaning of faith. This dichotomy sets the stage for Marcion's distinctive interpretation of the Christian scriptures. Whether one agrees with Marcion's beliefs or not, there's no denying their influence. His teachings continue to challenge and inspire, offering a unique perspective on the Christian faith. Marcion's beliefs led him to a profound conclusion about the Old Testament. His teachings, radical as they were, led him to reject the Hebrew scriptures entirely. In his view, these texts were simply incompatible with the teachings of Jesus Christ. Now, why did Marcion reject the Old Testament so completely? His reasoning was based on a stark contrast, he observed, between the nature of God as depicted in the Old Testament and the God revealed by Jesus in the New Testament. According to Marcion, the God of the Old Testament, often referred to as the Demiurge, was a deity of law, judgment, and wrath. This God, he argued, was harsh and punitive, quick to anger and slow to forgive. In Marcion's eyes, this God was morally inferior, a far cry from the benevolent and loving God revealed through Jesus Christ. He saw the Old Testament as a chronicle of this Demiurge's actions, filled with instances of wrath, punishment, and destruction. The Great Flood, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the plagues of Egypt, all these, to Marcion, were signs of a God who was not just stern, but harsh and unjust. Moreover, Marcion argued that the Old Testament was fundamentally at odds with the teachings of Jesus. Where the Old Testament God demanded strict adherence to laws and rituals, Jesus preached love, forgiveness, and grace. The Old Testament seemed to Marcion to be a document of exclusion, setting the chosen people of Israel apart from the rest of humanity. In contrast, Jesus' message was one of inclusion, offering salvation to all, Jew and Gentile alike. This stark contrast led Marcion to a radical conclusion. The God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament could not be the same deity. The Old Testament, he believed, did not reveal the true God, but rather a lesser, morally inferior deity. This belief led him to reject the Old Testament in its entirety, removing it from his version of the Christian canon. Now, it's worth noting that Marcion's rejection of the Old Testament was not universally accepted, even within his own movement. Many of his followers struggled with this aspect of his teachings, finding it hard to reconcile with the traditional view of a unified biblical canon. His critics, meanwhile, argued that Marcion's interpretation was overly simplistic, ignoring the nuanced portrayal of God found throughout the Old Testament. Yet, despite these criticisms, Marcion's rejection of the Old Testament was a key part of his theological perspective. It allowed him to maintain his belief in a God of pure love and grace, untainted by the wrath and judgment associated with the Old Testament. And while his views were controversial, they sparked a debate that would shape the course of Christian theology for centuries to come. This rejection of the Old Testament is key to understanding Marcion's unique theological perspective. Marcion's teachings revolve around a cosmic struggle. Such a statement introduces us to the heart of Marcion's dualistic worldview. In his theology, the universe is a battleground, a theater of conflict between two divine entities with opposing natures and intentions. Marcion envisaged a cosmic tug-of-war between the stern, judgmental deity of the Old Testament, known as the Demiurge, and the benevolent, loving God revealed in the New Testament. This dualism, this belief in two deities, was not just a theological curiosity. For Marcion, it was a matter of cosmic and personal significance. According to Marcion's theology, the Demiurge, the God of the Old Testament, was a lesser deity. This deity was a craftsman, a creator who fashioned the material world. But this world, in Marcion's view, was inherently flawed, filled with suffering and injustice. The Demiurge was not only the architect of this flawed world, but also its ruler, enforcing a strict system of laws and punishments. Contrastingly, the God of the New Testament was a deity of a wholly different nature. This God was benevolent, loving, and merciful. This God did not create the material world, but sought to save humanity from its inherent flaws and the harsh rule of the Demiurge. This cosmic struggle reflected a broader theme in Marcion's teachings: the conflict between law and grace, judgment and mercy, fear and love. The Demiurge, with his laws and judgments, represented the old order of fear and retribution. The God of the New Testament, on the other hand, symbolized a new order of grace and love, offering humanity a path of salvation. Salvation, in Marcion's view, was not about adherence to laws or rituals. It was about liberation from the oppressive rule of the Demiurge and the flawed material world he governed. Salvation was about embracing the grace and love of the God of the New Testament, the true God. This God, through Jesus Christ, offered humanity a way to transcend the dualistic struggle and attain a state of divine love and mercy. This dualistic worldview, this belief in a cosmic struggle between two deities, was not just an abstract concept for Marcion. It was a lived reality, a daily struggle between the forces of fear and love, law and grace, the Demiurge and the true God. It was a struggle that required a personal response, a commitment to the path of grace and love revealed by Jesus Christ. Marcion's dualistic worldview challenged traditional Christian beliefs, presenting a radically different understanding of God, the world, and salvation. It offered a stark contrast between the God of fear and judgment and the God of love and mercy. It emphasized the need for personal transformation, for liberation from the old order of fear and judgment, and for embracing the new order of grace and love. This dualistic worldview forms the backbone of Marcion's theology. It underscores his distinct teachings and his radical challenge to traditional Christian beliefs. It reflects his deep conviction in a cosmic struggle and his unshakable faith in the God of love and mercy. And it continues to provoke thought and debate, challenging us to ponder the nature of God, the world, and our place in it. At the heart of Marcion's teachings lies a message of grace and love. This central theme is a beacon of hope in a theology that often grapples with dualistic notions of good and evil, benevolence and malevolence. Marcion's understanding of salvation was distinct from traditional Christian concepts. He believed that salvation was not earned through adherence to laws or by fulfilling religious obligations, as was suggested by the Old Testament God, the Demiurge. Instead, Marcion proposed that salvation was a gift freely given by the benevolent God of the New Testament, a God of grace and mercy. This God did not demand obedience to laws or religious rituals. He was not a God of judgment and retribution, but a God of forgiveness and redemption. The concept of grace, in Marcion's view, was a radical departure from the legalistic understanding prevalent in the early Christian church. It was a concept that emphasized the unconditional love of God, a love so profound that it sought to redeem humanity not through judgment, but through mercy. And who better to embody this divine love and mercy than Jesus Christ? Marcion saw Jesus as the embodiment of the New Testament God's love. Jesus, in Marcion's theology, was not a judge or a lawgiver. He was a savior, a beacon of hope, the living manifestation of divine love. Through his teachings, his life, and his sacrificial death, Jesus revealed the true nature of God, a God not of wrath, but of love. Marcion's teachings painted a picture of a God who was not distant and judgmental, but close and compassionate. A God who did not demand perfection, but offered grace. A God who was not to be feared, but loved. This emphasis on grace and love is a defining feature of Marcion's theology. It is a message that resonates deeply with many, even today, as we continue to grapple with our understanding of God, love, and grace. This emphasis on grace and love is a defining feature of Marcion's theology. Marcion's beliefs were not received without controversy. Indeed, his radical ideas sent ripples across the early Christian world, ultimately leading to his excommunication. Marcion's teachings challenged the established Christian doctrines of his time, especially his stark distinction between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament. This bold assertion, along with his outright rejection of the Old Testament, was met with significant resistance from the early Christian church. His unconventional views were seen as a threat to the unity and coherence of the Christian faith, leading to his eventual excommunication. The early church fathers held a council in the mid-2nd century, where they firmly condemned Marcion as a heretic. They denounced his teachings, particularly his claim of two separate gods, as a deviation from the orthodox Christian belief in one unified God. However, the story of Marcionism does not end with its founder's condemnation. Despite the Church's rejection of Marcion's teachings, the impact of his beliefs reverberated throughout the centuries, influencing the development of Christian theology in profound ways. Marcion's emphasis on the New Testament and his dismissal of the Old Testament forced the early Church to confront and clarify its stance on the Hebrew Scriptures. This led to the establishment of the biblical canon as we know it today, with both the Old and New Testaments recognized as integral parts of Christian scripture. Moreover, Marcion's radical theology sparked a series of debates among early Christian thinkers, prompting them to articulate their beliefs more clearly and systematically. These debates laid the groundwork for the development of Christian doctrines, including the nature of God, the relationship between the Old and New Testaments, and the concept of grace and salvation. In essence, while Marcion's beliefs were vehemently rejected by the early church, they inadvertently played a significant role in shaping the course of Christian thought. His teachings served as a catalyst, prompting the church to refine its doctrines and solidify its beliefs in response to his controversial claims. Marcionism's influence extended beyond the confines of the early Christian church. His dualistic worldview and emphasis on the benevolent God of the New Testament resonated with later Christian movements, such as the Cathars in the Middle Ages and certain strands of Protestantism in the modern era. In conclusion, while Marcionism was received with hostility and condemnation in its time, its legacy continues to reverberate throughout Christian theology. Marcion's radical ideas, while deemed heretical, challenged the early church to articulate its beliefs more clearly and paved the way for the development of key Christian doctrines. Despite its condemnation, Marcionism left an indelible mark on Christian theology. Marcion's teachings continue to provoke discussion and debate. This is especially true in the modern context where the interpretation of his ideas has taken on new light. In contemporary theological discussions, scholars have critically examined Marcionism, offering various interpretations and evaluations. Some have deemed Marcion as a radical reformer who sought to purify Christianity from its Jewish roots. They point to his emphasis on the God of love and mercy as a reaction against the harsh, legalistic God portrayed in the Old Testament. Others, however, view Marcion as a divisive figure who oversimplified the complexities of the divine nature. They argue that his dichotomous view of God, splitting the deity into a malevolent Old Testament God and a benevolent New Testament God, fails to capture the holistic image of God presented in the Christian scriptures. Marcion's rejection of the Old Testament has also been a point of contention. Some scholars see this as a radical act of defiance against traditional Christian norms. Others, however, criticize Marcion for his selective approach to the scriptures, arguing that he discarded any texts that did not fit his theological framework. The enduring legacy of Marcionism is undeniable. Despite its condemnation as heretical, the movement's influence permeates certain aspects of Christian thought. Marcion's emphasis on grace and love, for instance, resonates with many Christians who reject the punitive, wrathful image of God. Moreover, Marcion's challenge to the Old Testament's validity forced the early church to define its own canon more clearly. In this way, Marcionism indirectly contributed to the formation of the Christian Bible as we know it today. Marcionism's influence extends beyond the realm of academia. In popular culture, Marcion's teachings have been co-opted by various groups seeking to promote a more inclusive, compassionate image of God. These modern Marcionites argue that the God of love revealed by Jesus Christ offers a more relevant, engaging vision of the divine than the judgmental God of the Old Testament. Yet, Marcionism's lasting impact is perhaps most evident in the ongoing discourse about the nature of God. The questions Marcion raised about the apparent contradictions between the Old and New Testament depictions of God, about the relationship between law and grace, about the problem of evil, these questions remain central to contemporary theological debates. In closing, let's remember that Marcionism, for all its controversy, invites us to grapple with fundamental questions about God's nature. It challenges us to rethink our understanding of the divine, urging us to see beyond simplistic binary categories. It reminds us that the quest to understand God is a complex, nuanced journey that continues to evolve with each passing generation. As we have seen, Marcionism offers a challenging and thought-provoking perspective on the nature of God in Christianity. So whether we agree with Marcion's views or not, we can appreciate the critical dialogue his teachings have sparked, a dialogue that continues to enrich our understanding of the divine.